Welcome to the Access Control section of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework Secure Methodology. My name is Mark Simos. I'm Lead Cybersecurity Architect at Microsoft. So let's get started. So when we take a look at access control, which is really very simply making sure that the right people have the right access to the right resources, but not the bad people, right? You want to make sure that the water is flowing through, but no pollutants or no poison is essentially through, no impersonators that are pretending to be someone else or pretending to be a legitimate corporate device, etc. And so that's really ultimately where it's at. And so when we look at the classic approach to it, and this is sort of pre-zero trust days, the network was used very heavily for access control. There's other controls that were also used, such as, do they have permission to that particular file or that folder or that server or application. There's quite a bit of role-based application and in some cases attribute-based, so an attribute of the user, etc. But ultimately, the main way that access control is provided was through the network. If someone was on the internal network, they had a lot of privilege and access to a lot of resources just by simply being on the corporate network. And those that were outside of that network, outside of that firewall or network perimeter, were much more limited. And so the approach that security had, this was sort of a dominant part of security strategies, is that if it's on the network, it's considered trusted at some level, and if it's off the network, then it is untrusted. So very much everything is tied to the network. If it's security is a network, network is security. There's a lot of sort of equation in there. And the challenge with that is that when everything in the business was done, or anything in the organization's processes was done on the network and the computers on the network, this wasn't a problem. It kind of worked. But once the resources started moving outside of that corporate network, and people had iPhones, and people were using, Dropbox and Box and other in Office 365 and SaaS services, this paradigm started breaking down very fast. The other piece, from a security standpoint, was that attackers were very reliably getting on the network. And they'd evolved from simple network attacks into phishing emails, stealing usernames and passwords, using those to log on to virtual private networks or VPNs. And so this model, this assumption, started showing its limitations in the modern world. And this is really where zero trust comes in. And by the way, this diagram is actually a result of a collaboration with the Open Group. And so when you look at the zero trust approach for this, the zero trust is really about pretty much protecting the assets where they are. Having centralized policy, centralized control, centralized monitoring to really be able to see those risks and understand what's going on and where the anomalies are, where the potential risk, the actual risk, the realized risk of a real attacker that has actually executed an attack and has access. So you definitely want that centralized visibility and control with zero trust, but not by restricting them to the corporate network, by putting security controls on the assets themselves, the databases, the cloud services, the end user devices, the documents themselves, and having them phone home for encryption keys. So zero trust is really much more flexible to allow the business to do what the business does, but securing the assets where they are and where they go. And so, that's really kind of the foundation of how we think about access control at Microsoft, and what we've seen really works well at our customers. So one of the things that's sort of interesting, because many security people are familiar with the concepts of authentication and authorization. Authentication is you are who you say you are, and authorization is you have, now that I know who you are, you have access to this particular resource. And so what we found within the zero trust world, much like the airline industry kind of developed a little bit better approach after the attacks of about 20 years ago, the 9/11 attacks, is it actually is a little bit better described as kind of a three-phase process. Authentication authorization is still there, but it's a little bit easier and a little bit clearer to think about it as 3 steps. So the first is known, right? I know who you are. Very much similar to classic authentication. In the case of the airline analogy, please show me your ID. Okay, now I know who you are. but I don't know if I trust you yet. And so this is the new step that's in between that Zero Trust really introduces, is I need to make sure I trust this account and I trust this device and that is trying to get access to these resources. And so the second piece is validating, can we trust this person? Are they trusted? Is it likely that someone has stolen their password? Have they given me a high level of confidence, through multi-factor authentication or biometrics or some other assurances, or that they're exhibiting the same pattern of behavior? They're acting just like they did yesterday and the day before and the day before that. So all of these different factors, are then brought in and said, hey, do we trust this person, right? Are they high, medium, low trust? And so that's really kind of the next piece as you modernize your authentication, is really separating those two. And it's not just that they're that person or that correct account, but that we can actually trust it at a high enough level. And this is really where the central security team would hand it off to the application, right? So this is what you can do universally across applications, across workloads. Just like in an airport, the airport security would then say, okay, this person doesn't seem to have anything dangerous on them. They've passed all the trust tests, they've done the background check, et cetera. And so now we're going to hand them off to the airlines to decide all the specifics, right? In the case of an airline, it would be, what type of ticket, what destination you're going to, things that the central security guard really doesn't care about. They're just making sure that the passenger themselves are safe. And so there's this third stage of allowed. And that's really how we're starting to think about this, evolving from just simple authentication authorization into more of a known, trusted, allowed, to make sure that we're explicitly recognizing those distinct steps at each stage. So the last piece we want to cover is kind of a view of access control and what it looks like. And this is a simpler diagram. There's a more detailed, complex one that we link to within the documentation that was developed as part of the Securing Privilege Access Roadmap. It actually is the evolution of our original tier model for administrative access. And so this is a little simpler view of it that shows the basics of just access control, through a Zero Trust lens, of course. So the first part, it's really, really important. It's often easy to forget, especially for technologists, that this is about securing business resources. This is about securing things that matter to that business leadership, or in the case of governments and non-governmental organizations and nonprofits and the like, mission, right? What is important to the organization? That is the most important thing. And almost all of the time, there's a few exceptions, the data of the organization stores business value, and then the applications that are used in the data center or on the different devices and whatnot are what allow people to create value for the organization. And so this is really what the attackers are after in almost all cases. This is what you want to protect in almost all cases. And so that data workload plane, which is where your servers and applications are in the data center, is really what this is about at the end of the day. Now, most organizations don't live on one app alone. People use multiple apps. They have an HR app. They have a retail app for their customers to buy things. There's hundreds and sometimes thousands of applications in an organization, spread across on-premise and Azure and AWS and GCP and all sorts of other providers as well, especially in the SaaS space. And so you need to have a management plane to manage those and just allocate resources and monitor the health of them, making sure they're up and running and supportable, et cetera. And so that's what the management plane kicks in, is just the ability to manage all those multiple resources, like all the different servers and applications within Azure, for example. Now, there's another plane that's on top of that, and these are often quite similar, but they're a little bit different. The control plane is where you govern access control. And so the control plane is really about who can decide who can access what, right? And so this is the people that are in control of control, as it were, or the accounts that are and the systems that are. And so this really is where, this is where we're seeing the biggest transition. Well, we're seeing a big transition in management plane to going to the cloud. We're also seeing a big transition in the control plane as we've gone from that network oriented thought process. And the network is still part of the control plane, but it's having less and less impact as these new resources really don't live on the corporate network. And so we're seeing that sort of shift in how much you use the network as a control plane versus the applications. Excuse me, the identity. So a lot more focus on the identity piece. And this is actually a good thing, not only because it covers these new resources, but also brings in richer context and better awareness of what the user and the application are trying to do at the time, or the attacker is trying to do at the time. So a little bit closer to those business workflows. Now, of course, you have to access all these resources, right? And so you have two fundamental different ways of interacting with it. A human, a biological person operating with a keyboard, a mobile device, a mouse, you name it, is interacting with it in human speed and for all those portals and graphical user interfaces and whatnot. Then you have application access. This is where APIs, or application programming interfaces, really kick in. And you have, for example, if you have an automated system where you go to a retail store, someone buys stuff off the shelf, and then you have an automated inventory system that asks the manufacturer, add 3 more to the next order. And then you have a distribution center that says, yes, you're going to need to ship a few more boxes after the manufacturer is done with it. All those kind of things are done with computer-to-computer communications through APIs. And so you do have to accommodate, as you're thinking through the security of your system, making sure you're securing that API access, not just the human access. And the last piece, which is very, very important, is privileged access. This is really the difference in many ways between, from a security standpoint, losing a shepherd versus losing a sheep. Because if you lose an admin account, just like losing a shepherd, the whole flock is at risk, right? Every single sheep in it. Versus a single standard user account has much less business impact. It can be high, but the difference between having one particular user account compromised, is the likelihood of that damaging an organization's reputation and revenue high? It's there, but it's not significant. But if you lose an admin that can control and manage a lot of workloads, or a lot of or business critical workloads in the data plane, or the entire access control of the organization itself, say a domain admin or enterprise admin, an Active Directory, or a global admin in Azure Active Directory, losing an account that has that much permission is a very, very bad proposition. And so you want to be looking at those privileged access accounts with a high business impact very differently and securing them, often with the same controls, just much more restrictive, much more closely monitored, just a higher level of security for this privileged access because of that resultant business impact. So when we think about the criteria for success as you build an access control strategy to accommodate all these different types of access control, you want it to be secure. You want the strongest security that is tolerable by these different accounts and users. You want it to be consistent. You don't want to have, we do it this one way here, but we do it a different way here, and we do something else here. We have some LDAP directories over here, and I don't even know if that does MFA or what passwords they use. Like the more you have these inconsistencies across your environment, the more that you have a chance for the attackers to kind of find a weakness and then use that and parlay that into your environment. Has to be comprehensive, so you don't want to be thinking about it purely, if we keep them out at the firewall, we're done. You need to have much more of a nuanced approach that is able to use the right control that is as close to that asset as possible, as close to the user as possible, so you're not really interrupting the workflow. Something that protects the account directly, something that protects the data directly, something that protects the application directory, makes it a lot more flexible, and it gives you the ability to protect it wherever it is, inside, outside the firewall, etc. And then identity-centric, like I said, you absolutely have places, especially in the operational technology or OT space with a SCADA and ICS and these older machines or older computers that are controlling physical machines. You simply don't have modern identity protocols. You're lucky that you have IP connectivity that you can intercept with a firewall. Completely get that. There's definitely a place for those, legacy applications in your data center, whether it's infrastructure as a service, IaaS, or whether it's in an on-premise data center. These applications were built with the assumption they're on a private network. So you've got to provide that, get that. But if you have the choice and if you have the option, always bias towards identity. You want to make sure you're leading with the identity style controls, because those are much more aware of the application. They're much more aware of the user, and they're much better if you have the choice. And we're seeing better and better options coming through Azure with managed service identities and other similar features that really make it a lot easier to use identity controls even within a data center over on-prem. And so this has been a summary of Zero Trust Access Control. Hopefully this was useful to y'all, and thank you very much for your time and for watching.